Good evening. Please welcome Joe Curtin, Managing Director, Power and Climate of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Curtin. I'm Managing Director of the Power and Climate team at the Rockefeller Foundation. So welcome to our new convening space. And to those of you online, welcome to our Zoom space, I suppose. Today, we're kicking off a brand new series called the Connected series. And this is to bring us into conversation with leaders from around the globe who have used our Bellagio Center to advance their work. And for those of you who haven't been, our convening space in Bellagio, Italy, is a special and inspiring place. It's an uplifting place. And in fact, I had an opportunity to spend some time in Bellagio for the first time in July. And so I can say that based on firsthand experience. And we use our Bellagio space to support remarkable leaders to advance their work. And we've been doing that for 6 decades now. People like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Maya Angelou, Muhammad Yunus, who have paved the way to justice for thousands of people. And I'm pleased to invite you this evening into dialogue with another one of these leaders, Katie Redford. Welcome, Katie. She was a Bellagio Fellow in 2018, I believe, and she will be discussing her recent book, partially penned in Bellagio, The Revolution Will Not Be Litigated. She will also be hosting a dialogue with some of her grantees who are fighting to protect natural places and the places they live and love in America from exploitation by the fossil fuel industry. And this work is very close to the heart of what we do at the Rockefeller Foundation. We have a very close affinity with this work because we also focus on climate justice. And for our part, this means using clean and renewable energy to uplift the lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the world. And in fact, we're so committed to this work that we made the biggest commitment in our 113-year history of $500 million invested in this work in 2020. Thank you. And much of my own work is actually focused on coal, and both on preventing the construction of coal plants that are planned at the moment, but also on finding solutions to the early decommissioning of existing coal assets. And so, as I said, we have a really deep appreciation for the work of Equation Campaign, and we're very honored to host you today, Katie, and your grantees for today's dialogue. Our attention tonight and through this entire series is to help catalyze new ideas and new partnerships that we need to address the world's greatest challenges. So I'm delighted to introduce Katie Redford, Executive Director of Equation Campaign, which funds, as I said, movements and leaders focused on keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Prior to her current role, Katie was a founding director of Earth Rights International. She's a lawyer by training with expertise in human rights, climate justice, and corporate accountability, and she has spearheaded legal strategies to hold corporations accountable for human rights and environmental abuses around the world. So thank you so much for being here, Katie. Very excited to hear from you and your partners on the work that you're doing. Over to you.
Thank you. All right, where do you want me? Here or here? I already don't know what I'm doing. This is like difficult. Yeah? Right here? Okay. Following directions. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Okay, this is really cool to be here at the Rockefeller Foundation talking about this book, which I will admit when I was at Bellagio, I was like, there is no way I'm going to write this damn book. It is really hard to write a book. But here it is, and here we are, and it's just so great to see so many friends, grantees, partners, my son, my high school best friend and wingman, which is when all the rabble-rousing really began. Colleagues, so thanks so much for coming. This is kind of like, this is your life. So yeah, as Joseph said, I was a Bellagio Fellow in 2018, which was a moment in my life. I had just entered the 25th year. Can't believe I'm saying that. 5 years ago, 25th year of running Earth Rights International, the organization that I co-founded to combine the power of law and the power of people in defense of human rights and the environment. And what does that mean? It really means like we started Earth Rights to sue some oil companies for human rights abuses and environmental harms around the world. And I had been doing this work, challenging corporate power, representing communities, fighting and working alongside people who lived the harms of corporate abuse in the pursuit of justice. And I was thinking to myself, like, okay, first of all, what am I going to do when I grow up? Because I've been doing this for 25 years. And second of all, it's just not going fast enough for the scale and the speed that the science demands when we think about the most urgent human rights crisis in the world, which is the injustice of the climate crisis. And that's what I was thinking in 2018, back in the days before the 2019 IPCC report. That was the one that we thought was scary. if only it was that scary. It's obviously gotten a lot worse. And I had this opportunity to go to Bellagio to sort of reflect on the 25 years of doing what people all along the way told us was impossible. You can't hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses. You can't bring the power of the law to bear on companies when they go outside your jurisdiction, when they go overseas. Corporations are above the law when it comes to human rights abuses. And we proved them wrong at Earth Rights. And the question kept coming up, but how do we address the corporate complicity and the abuse of human rights and the planet and the potential for a future that we can live on this planet together in justice and in peace, or even just at all. And I went to Bellagio thinking I was going to write a book about all of it, and thinking I was going to interview a bunch of people that I had worked with over the course of 25 years, the people with lived experience, the people who had run similarly impossible strategies, campaigns, to do the impossible, to take on David and Goliath impossible fights, to gather the lessons from the experts that I had met during the course of my life as a lawyer, and thinking that I'm going to bring these stories together in a book so that I could create a book that I wish I could have had when I was in law school. Because when you're in law school, and in fact, any university, most formal academic institutions, you're reading people who study things. In law school, most of what you read and study is written by a judge, by an academic, by an appellate judge or a Supreme Court judge. And they're writing about what you think is supposed to be justice, but yet they have no lived experience of injustice. Most of the people that are teaching law students across the country and the world are people who have gone to law school, practiced in a law firm, sit on a bench with a black robe, or teach in academia. And clearly, if you went outside today, it is not justice. It is not the kind of justice that is going to bring the kind of change that we need in the time that we have. And so that was my goal. I got there and I realized very quickly that 1 month is not enough to write a whole book on how to address the climate crisis and bring the end of the fossil fuel era. But luckily, one of the great things about Bellagio is that they force you into a room with people who have lots of different experiences, who come from academia, from journalism, artists. And within the first week, the dean of University of California in Los Angeles Public Health said, well, you shouldn't write a book, Katie. You need to write a book. What you need to do is have a conference and get all the people who really are the experts to write the chapter. And I was like, oh, you had me at you don't need to write a book. That's awesome. Okay. And then the second thing that happened was someone who was there who was what I call a real writer, my co-editor, Mark Gavisser. He said, you know, I'm sure you're a great writer, Katie, but if a lawyer writes this book, no one's going to want to read it. And he said, and I've been talking to you at these cocktail parties that Bellagio throws overlooking Lake Como. It's very beautiful. And he's like, and you keep talking about storytelling, the power of storytelling as a form of justice, as a form of learning, as a form of sharing. And the people that you're talking about putting in the book and lifting up, they should tell their own stories. They have the experience, and narrative needs to drive this book. And so thankfully, the magic of what the Rockefeller Foundation does with Bellagio worked. And I listened to the dean and said, okay, we'll have a conference. Bellagio actually hosted our conference. Most of the people who are in this book were at the conference, and we worked with them to tell their own stories, write their own narratives, and actually be the experts that they are and be recognized as the experts that they are, because these are the experts that we need to be listening to. If the experts alone that have been lifted up, and thankfully so, in the movement for climate justice, only the scientists, only the government officials, only the policy people, only the lawyers, if they had all the answers, we wouldn't be in the mess that we are in right now. And so the experts in this book are the folks who don't have time to write a book. And yet this is who we need to be listening to and who we need to have in classrooms and in students' hands and out in the world today. And so I'm going to just read you a little bit from the book, because that's, I guess, what you're supposed to do at a book thing. And that means I have to put my glasses on. But I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction to give you an idea of what's in it. And then one little piece. And then we're going to get to the main event, which is the other experts, the fabulous experts, Jane, Justin, and Crystal, who we're so lucky to have here today. So from the introduction, this is a little bit of the theory of change, and then I'm gonna tell you also how Bellagio came at a moment where I was gearing up for what I didn't know yet was going to be the equation campaign, but the lessons that I also needed to learn for what I think is the biggest fight of our lives, and what I've, I guess, been preparing for my whole life, which is to try to bring what I have to the power, to the climate crisis. Okay. So if the contributors to this book understand the power of narrative as a tool, they also explore it as a personal methodology. They start from the premise that theories of change are not designed in laboratories or seminar rooms, but rather come out of a reflection on practice. And so all of these essays and interviews are personal reflections written as a counter to, or perhaps a companion to, the analysis of jurisprudence or the polemics of manifestos. The book is not an investigation into movements themselves and what makes them sustainable or effective. Rather, it is about movements' relationship with the law and with legal advocacy as a strategy among many to achieve meaningful objectives. Still, both the lawyers and the non-lawyers in this book, and it's about half and half, or the anti-lawyers, some of them will say, think deeply about what movements are in an effort to understand their relationship to legal strategy. And it is clear from their experiences, while there is no blueprint for how legal strategy can be used to help shift power, there is a common pattern of experience. Movements are born of pain and anger. They sustain momentum by creativity and community, by empathy and joy. They navigate uncertainty and chaos, and they use imperfect tools such as the law to seek justice and relief. And so I want to focus on some words there: power, pain, anger, community, creativity, and joy. These are not just fluffy words, these are strategies. These are strategies that shift power, confront and disrupt power, and lead to the kind of transformative change that we need and that we must invest in. It is out of a crucible of such emotion, rather than from the seminar rooms of strategists or legal advisors, that movements emerge with their expressions not only of pain and anger, but joy and creativity too. So many of this book's contributors note the exhilaration and regenerative energy of being on the streets, the Black Lives Matter protests, pro-abortion rallies, the popular uprising in Beirut, Russia, climate justice protests the world over. And I'm going to finish this part with a piece from Farhana Yamin, who is a climate lawyer. And her chapter is called Why Climate Lawyers Need to Break the Law. On April 16th, 2019, I superglued my hands to the pavement outside the headquarters of the oil company Shell in London. I tried to get to the main door, but fell short as I was surrounded by dozens of neon-jacketed policemen. I had been a legal advisor in the United Nations climate negotiations for nearly 30 years. But that Tuesday, I decided it was time to join those who had decided to break the law. How else could we get people to pay attention to the climate crisis already upon us? I wanted to draw attention to Shell's prior knowledge and cover-up of the devastating impacts of climate pollution and their continued funding of oil exploration. But I also wanted to show how ridiculous it was that a law-abiding mother of four should walk away in handcuffs while one of the world's major corporate polluters remained unaccountable for its role in causing irreversible planetary destruction. The old way of doing things isn't working. The oil barons are flouting laws and committing ecocide. We need to alert the world to this injustice. The old way of doing things isn't working. We certainly need all the old ways of doing things. In the climate movement and in the climate, I wouldn't even actually say climate movement. There hasn't really been a climate movement until very recently, in my opinion. Climate strategy and climate campaigns for the past 30 years have relied on basically, I think, a single sort of hope, folly, but not really folly. It makes sense. Let's get the best, most accurate science from the best scientists in the world. Let's present it to governments, decision makers, and people in power. And then obviously they'll do the right thing. How's that working out? We know everything we need to know about climate science. We have the science. We know how to actually make the transition to a just transition that we need, and that is all of our right. We have the science, we have the technology, we have the knowledge, we have the money and the resources. We even still have the time to do what we need to do. What we don't have is the power to make it so. And that is what this book is about. And that is what the people who you're going to hear from tonight are also about. And that is what the Equation Campaign, the organization that I now run, which was co-founded by two members of the Rockefeller family. So see how this all works out. Yes, coming full circle, to fund movements on the ground to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Because as I thought about in Bellagio and reflected on the course of my career, and hence the title of the book, you know, yes, the arc of history swings towards justice, but we don't have time for the arc of history to swing when it comes to the climate crisis. We just don't have the time. And so how do we actually make the changes that we know we need to make in the time that we have? It's about power. Power that only throughout the course of history has come from movements, massive, vast movements led by the people who are impacted and hit hardest, first and worst, by the harms and threats that they're aiming to change. movements led by people on the front lines, for whom whatever they are fighting about or for is a matter of life and death. And that is what it's going to take to shift power to do what we need to do, what the science demands. Now, what does the science demand? Thankfully, we do have the science, because that 30 years of climate science really is absolutely clear. We know that we have 10 years to cut fossil fuel emissions in half. We have until 2030. The Equation campaign was started in 2020. We're going full speed for 10 years, and then we're shutting down in 2030 after we win, right? 10 years to cut fossil fuel emissions in half. It's not impossible, but that's a big, big lift, okay? Right now, here's what else we know. We know that the world's producing operations, oil, gas, and coal producing operations that are already in production and operation, have way more supplies than we can afford to burn and stay within 1.5 degrees. Okay, so can't even burn what we have. So obviously, our carbon budget cannot afford one new fossil fuel project anywhere in the world. The United States is supposedly a climate leader, right? We are the leader right now in global oil, gas production, export, and operations. Number one. We are the number one country in the world. We have passed Saudi Arabia. We have passed Russia. So while we are talking a good game, and not we, the powers that be, talking a good game about reducing emissions, we are selling, digging, drilling, exporting to the ends of the earth. The United States right now, just what's publicly available, has planned expansion and investments in 4,000 gigatons of new carbon emissions. 4,000. We can't afford one more pound. Forget about 4,000 gigatons. So the number one rule about when you're in a hole, what do? Stop digging, okay? We're in a hole. The United States is digging, 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 digging. And what is stopping the oil and gas industry every step of the way when they are stopped? What does the impossible? What wins this David and Goliath fights? Movements on the ground led by people who live where the industry is operating. The people who you're going to hear from have all defeated oil and gas projects. They've led movements. They've organized resistance on the ground in Standing Rock, in Keystone XL, in Byhalia, the Byhalia pipeline in Memphis. Okay, the industry that we have to stop because the science tells us we cannot afford one more project. The industry has a term called getting standing rocked. They don't want that to happen. They have a term called the Keystone effect. Okay, we've got someone who led the Getting Standing Rocked movement right here, Crystal Tubles. We've got Jane Clabb from the Keystone Effect, who is behind it, and they'll tell you all about it. And then I don't think they have the Byhalia effect yet, but they have they've got the Tennessee Three. There's no one in Tennessee or in this room who doesn't know the Justin effect, and you're going to get to experience it tonight. This is what stops the industry time and time again. These are the experts that we need to listen to, the people with the lived experience. They've been there, they've done that. They're going to tell us how to do it. This is what Equation Campaign is putting every single ounce of our heart, soul, mind, and money into supporting, because while this is what the industry is most afraid of, it is the most underfunded and undersupported and under-recognized strategy in climate philanthropy. Less than 1% of climate funding goes to people who are living where the industry operates. And yet, this is what the industry cites as the number one threat to their operations, that we must shut down, as a matter of life and death, because it is for all of us. So thank you for doing the work that you do. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to call up onto the stage Crystal, Jane, and Justin. Crystal Tuples is the executive director of Honor the Earth, a national Indigenous-led climate justice and environmental justice organization, and also was one of my clients at one point when Energy Transfer decided that she was basically the Al Capone of the Standing Rock Canyon and decided to sue her for $900 million. We won that lawsuit, not because of us, but because nothing wrong except protect the land and water. So keep doing it. Thank you.
Do we go
right ahead.
Oh,
Yes.
this is the 10-minute.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, Pivish, Mene Wostatnane have. My name's Crystal Tuples. I'm Oglala Lakota, Northern Cheyenne. Yeah, it's really an honor to be here. Thank you, Katie. And it's an honor to be included in the book. I think, my journey has been a long journey. I started off being raised by organizers. People often ask, what brought you into the movement, or what was the day that you joined the movement? And as an Oglala woman, as a Northern Cheyenne, as, a Native American woman, I was born into this. I really didn't get a choice, because I could be home trying to just live my life, work, be with family, all of that. And people are still trying to come into my community and mine. And to destroy the land and to violate the land, violate our rights, violate the people that have relationship to the land. And so even in just trying to exist as a human being, I can't just do that. So I never had that choice about when I entered the movement or when I started to do this work or when I made that decision. I was also raised by organizers. Both my parents organized against the Otter Creek coal mine, which would have been the largest coal mine in the lower 48 states had it gone through. Northern Cheyenne community where I live in southeastern Montana is a really small community, but they organized pretty quickly. My grandparents, my parents, younger generations. So this was like a 4-generation battle. And so far we've been able to successfully keep coal mining off of our lands. We also have some of the highest air and water quality standards in the country, and so there's reasons why we organize. There's reasons why we do the things we do. And I think that, I grew up with that organizing in high school. And so my family really instilled in me to really, serve your people, protect the land, and we need to leave something for future generations and those that aren't here yet. And so that's what I've been doing. I've gone down many different paths. I'm an activist, I'm an organizer, I'm a veteran, and all of those things have moved me in different directions to where I am now. And I would say, as Katie mentioned, during Standing Rock, we did what we had to do to maintain our relationship to land. We were given inherent rights and inherent responsibilities to the land as Indigenous peoples. And so for simply enacting those, I was slapped with a lawsuit. We were able to get those charges dismissed. I had an amazing support system. But what I will say is that I was really fortunate, and not everyone has access to that. And so that's really important to note that, that although I had the network and the relationship and the friendships to be able to fight that fight, not every activist is that fortunate. And most actually are not. And so just to name that, and as I went forward, I've been down many different journeys, but I would say that, I'm moving into a phase where I'm just organizing to win. I'm trying to organize myself out of a job, because at some point we should not be doing this work.
Yes.
And so, the goal is not to just keep money rolling into nonprofits to keep doing this work. The goal is to actually defeat the fossil fuel industry and to protect this earth. That means if we are successful, at some point we won't have jobs. And so hopefully we move
Or in a
that-
different space at least.
Yeah, we'll move to a different space of organizing. But I will say this, Honor the Earth is in our 30th year anniversary. Moving into this 30th year anniversary, we are setting some new priorities. We are redefining how we are going to fight these fights. And we will not only be an environmental justice organization, but we will organize at the intersections of environmental justice, because we cannot win these fights alone, right? As a veteran strategist, I know that we have to define our battlefield. We have to define who our allies are. We have to define what the strategy is, the many different tactics, and we can't do that alone. We have to fight on every single front. So the old ways of doing things are still relevant, still need to be brought up, and we have to innovate. We have to imagine. We have to be creative about how we go forward. Some of the work that I was really honored to do in the past was land back. Land back's a really scary term for a lot of folks, right? But I do think that folks really want the solutions to climate change to be in this nice, tidy package, right? There's one singular answer, and that's going to be the answer that we move towards. That's not reality. Climate change is rooted and directly caused by settler colonialism, white supremacy, and racial capitalism. So if we are actually going to defeat that, and we are actually going to prevent more catastrophes from happening, right? Right now, how many fires can we name that are happening globally? How many hurricanes have made landfall that typically don't? How many, earthquakes are happening currently? All of that's going on, and all of that has roots, right? Settler colonialism on these lands, right, is the root. Imperialism, militarism. The U.S. military is one of the largest polluters in the world, right? So we are serious about fighting, and we are serious about environmental justice and preventing climate change, then it has to be at the intersections. It has to be at the intersections of environmental justice and law, environmental justice and social justice, environmental justice and militarism and imperialism, everywhere across the board. We have to fight those fights. And like I said, the solutions are not going to be this nice little package, right? Like solar's it, that's the answer, or hemp is it, that's the one answer, or any of that, or a just transition, right, to green mining is the answer. That's not true. That's not how the solutions look, right? Because just mining, green mining, that is now the big thing that's happening. 75% of the minerals and the resources needed for this transition mining to happen are on indigenous lands. And so who do we think is going to pay for it, for this just transition to happen, right? And so we cannot allow false solutions to take over our strategies and what we're doing. We cannot allow carbon capture or just transition and just mining to be the answer. We cannot allow for, any of the false solutions that are being presented right now. We have to actually go back to the roots, right? And so for us in our organization, we present land back, indigenous land back, because who is the most impacted? Who is the most? We are not, just impacted and affected, right? And that's the language I think the world of philanthropy likes to use. We are targeted.
Yeah.
Black, brown, indigenous communities are targeted communities. We are the ones that experience climate change and climate catastrophe first, foremost, and the worst, as Katie said earlier. And so therefore the answers, the solutions lie in what our communities have done since time immemorial. I can trace my lineage back. I know what my ancestors fought for. I know what they gave their lives up for. I know what they died for, right? And so we have been doing this work. The answers live right in those communities. It lives right in the front lines. And it does include solar. It does include hemp. It does include like e-waste recycling. It also includes investing into the folks that are right there on those front lines. It includes investing into our young people, our youth, in creating science warriors, right? Traditional ecological knowledge with Western science, right? Those have to exist. We have to be able to marry those things and to bring that to the table. And so there's a lot of different things that happen, but quickly as I wrap up, naming land back. Land back isn't just about indigenous folks reclaiming land. We were fully thriving economies and societies pre-colonization. We stewarded the land that we now see as national parks that are pristine and untouched. They are that way because of us. We managed and cared for them all of that time, right? So we do hold those solutions. We do hold those answers. And so land back is also reclaiming our relationship to the land. It's reclaiming those traditional stewarding practices. It's reclaiming our language, our ceremony, our spirituality, all tied to the land. It's also reclaiming governance systems, reclaiming healthcare, food, education, housing systems. All of that existed, and it was all based on relationship to the land. So as we are doing this work, we have to expand how we're defining land back, and we have to use it as a political framework to really address that. And we have to also accept that it's not going to come in a cute, tiny package, right? And it's not going to be one solution. It's going to be a series of relationships and networks and collaboration, cross movement building, all of that, all which is laid out in the book, right? Those relationships that exist across all of these different movement spaces. And so with that, I just thank everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Crystal. So much about community and relationships and working collectively, and it's powerful and it's also super fun. And I am so excited to introduce Jane Clubb, who also is working with folks on the ground, on the land, fighting to stop all the things that threaten the land, the water, and the climate, because it's never just one thing. It's all the things if you live there. So Jane Clubb is the director of BOLD and also the Pipeline Fighters Hub, and one of the reasons there's something called the Keystone Effect. So take it away, Jane.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you for having us today, the Rockefeller Foundation, which, I think a lot of our work that's done at the local level really couldn't happen without the Equation Campaign, recognizing that sometimes it is the small but mighty groups on the ground in rural states and frontline communities that get the work done, that we definitely need the big greens and the medium greens. I love those groups. They help us with lots of white papers and other things that we don't have time to write and don't have the scientific background to do. But those of us that live on the land, love the land, and will do anything to protect that land are the ones that really should be funded. There's lots of quotes that could be said about it, but it's basically that those closest to the pain are the ones that have the solutions. And those closest to the pain should then be the ones that are funded to deploy those solutions. I was not a climate advocate or an activist when I was an activist, but not a climate activist, when Keystone XL came knocking on the doors of farmers and ranchers who I love. My husband's in the ranching business. Many of them started to call me saying, have you heard about this pipeline? It's going to use eminent domain. We know nothing about this company. Is there something that you can do? They knew I was involved in politics. And so they thought it was as easy as literally the suggestion was, can't you just call President Obama and tell him that this is a bad idea? And I was like, I don't have his phone number. So I think it's going to take a lot more organizing before he listens to us. But I really didn't have a playbook. At the time, that was 15 years ago. Standing Rock hadn't happened yet. MV Mountain Valley Pipeline hadn't happened yet. Byhalia Pipeline fight hadn't happened yet. We were all really flying by the seat of our pants. And so we started to deploy organizing tactics that came natural to us, which was organizing the people that were on the pipeline routes. So for us in Nebraska, which is where I was focused on, it was the farmers and ranchers who were living in these communities who were getting the eminent domain notices. But about a year into organizing with the farmers and ranchers, we realized quickly two things. One, the tribal nations were also fighting, especially in South Dakota, but also in Nebraska, the same pipeline fight, and we weren't talking. And so we all came together at a gathering, which was really pivotal for the fight. Because I think what the pipeline companies try to do in all these fights is to divide and conquer, right? So they keep the white farmers and ranchers, and then they offer them more money thinking that that will solve it. They start to hire cultural resource directors of tribal nations and think that that will then calm the waters. And so we thought, well, if we all came together and didn't let them divide us, even though there's lots of differences, right? I organize alongside very conservative Republicans who don't agree with me on pretty much anything else other than protecting people's property rights and protecting water for future generations. So if I went into those rooms and said, well, unless you believe in climate change and all these other things that I also believe in, women's reproductive rights, criminal justice reform, then I don't want to organize with you, then Keystone XL would be in the ground and lots of other pipelines would be in the ground. What I also think is important is that we don't stop there. And I think this is where Crystal, I 100% agree with you. If I also went into those rooms as we were organizing against the Keystone XL pipeline and didn't talk about other issues and just shrugged my shoulders when one of them made a racist comment or one of them talked about, how I was wrong on gun reform, then I also wouldn't be honest to who I was. And I think along the way, they learned more about gun reform and women's reproductive rights. And I learned more about how they view guns and, all the different, which is a different view, and really how they steward the land and will do anything to protect that land. But it was also a reckoning for them when we were up with the tribal nations in South Dakota, because they had to come face to face with the reality that their families are living and working and earning a living and generating wealth on land that the same tribal nations that were in the room had been taken away from them. And that was not an easy transition for kind of white, rough and tough farmers and ranchers who don't ever show any weakness. But it was that meeting in South Dakota, plus lots of actions, whether it was spirit camps or planting Ponca sacred corn on the Ponca Trail of Tears where the pipeline would have been crossing, or going to DC and them getting on airplanes for the first time and trying sushi with, all these climate activists. It was all those small moments, but also the big moments that made us an unlikely alliance that could never be divided. And that is, for me, one of the big secrets of the success of Keystone. And then came the lawyers. We would have never been able to keep that unlikely alliance together if we also didn't have lawyers backing them up in the courts. Because there can only be so many times we can organize creative actions at State Department hearings and Public Service Commission hearings. Eventually, people turn to us and say, I need a lawyer. I need a lawyer that is going to be just as powerful as the pipeline company, who can protect my rights and can help us stop this pipeline. And so the lawyers worked hand in glove with us, and we organized the landowners into essentially a union. We call it the easement action teams, where all of them had the same lawyer. They all came together. That lawyer then told the pipeline companies, you don't get to start peeling them off, offering them more money and doing all these other divisive tactics that these pipeline companies do, because they were now organized into a collective group. And we worked shoulder to shoulder with the tribal nations. Never once did the farmers sell out to say, if you give us more money, go ahead and cross the Ponca Trail of Tears and go ahead and cross all the other cultural resources. We stuck together as a team. And it meant many of us learning hard lessons, but it also meant us coming together as one group. And without the lawyers, I'm not sure we would have been able to win. I can come up with lots of creative actions. Like, it's one of the things that I'm really proud about myself, right? We built a barn in the pipeline route because you can't have any structures inside pipeline routes. And so that was like a visual for rural communities, our barns. We put solar, a wind tower, and told President Obama, you have a choice. You can tear this barn down and that we all built by hand and build this, dirty tar sands pipeline, or you can support us, right? You can choose us over big oil. So all those creative actions mattered and built community. But without the lawyers in the courtroom, without the lawyers filing papers to the State Department, without the lawyers filing paperwork at each of our public service commissions along the route, we would have never won. And I think the lawyers would say, without the organizing, without the stories, without, symbols of our fight, they would have never had the stories to tell inside the courtroom. So this book is a beautiful display of that. it tells not only our stories of activists and those of us on the ground, but it tells the stories of the lawyers who often are the unsung heroes of many of our fights, that so beautifully told in the book. And I'll just close by saying the chapter on Black Lives Matter, it's one of the first chapters in the book, was beautiful because it showed that a lawyer also has doubts about their strategies. As activists, we always have doubts. Is this working? You know, what do we have to retool? That was the other thing that I really loved about your book, Katie, is that it opens up a side to the legal perspective that lawyers are people and they have deep grounding in these communities that they want to help. And so buy the book, number one. And if you want to help support stopping all these bad fossil fuel projects so we can build clean energy in the right way, support the small groups.
All right. We all know the phrase "justice delayed is justice denied," but you can flip that. Injustice delayed is injustice denied. And you know, the Black and Veatch, like I said, surveyed oil companies and oil executives saying, what's the biggest threat to your ability to expand? And they said delays from opposition groups. And all those actions that all of you delay until you delay through a pandemic and you delay through Trump, who fast-tracked that pipeline until it's over, until it's killed, right? And so this is what people do, and it is a combination of lawyers and movements and frontline communities. And so now, last but not least, Justin J. Pearson, Representative Pearson, who many people don't know actually cut his teeth fighting pipelines, as we all do. Who doesn't? The Byhalia pipeline in Memphis, Tennessee, which I think was one of the fastest defeats of any pipeline that I've ever experienced. So power to you, Representative Pearson, and right on over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. Thanks to all of you. People power. At the core of any victory is the people, and are the people who resist and who persist despite all of the adversity. I mean, you look at those timelines of the fights with Keystone, how many people for years continued on, pressed on. And I was a part of the Ponca harvest and the remembrance of people who passed on, right? But we're still on the battlefield, as you said, in the Black church, on the fight. It is very much hard work, and it's heart work in hearing these extraordinary stories. And I remember Standing Rock, and I was in college when that happened, and thinking back on like that, what that moment meant for me. I didn't have the words environmental justice. I didn't understand all those things, but I did see folks who were in a fight, right? And they said this mattered. And they stayed until the very end, right? Like I was like, that was a moment for me. And years later, we would be fighting the Byhalia pipeline. Never knew I would be a part of any fight against fossil fuel. Never saw that in my future. I was not an environmental advocate or anything like that. And then it hit home, right? And we come home after the pandemic. My entire family pretty much moved back in with my parents. They were empty nesters for a short time. God bless them. And we all came right back. And we learned about this pipeline fight, right? And Katie mentioned the length of it being relatively short, but the reality is there were so many other fights that you could look to. Right? There were so many other people who had been in this a longer period of time. And so a lot of wisdom was gained. A lot of people who had been proximate to the fight helped us and fueled our fight in order for us to get to the outcome that we did. And so it's an ode to the people in Boxtown and Westwood and our communities who resisted, and then those who joined the fight. And so I'll say just a couple of things here, which is, you know, during that pandemic, the summer of Black Death, and this is something that was already mentioned during the Black Lives Matter protests, we have the lynching of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and a big question is being asked by Black folk, is being asked by white folk, is by liberal people, progressive people. It's like, what is happening to the experience of Black people, and why is it so different? Right? What is really going on? And so, you know, everybody bought all the books that they could offline, trying to figure out what happened. right? Where did things go wrong? And it was a magnificent moment in a lot of reasons, for a lot of reasons, because it was the first time people started to look and say, what am I doing to be complicit in this system? And then we had the global pandemic going on. And for a long time, people were talking, saying, this is everybody, it's an equal opportunity virus. Everybody can get it. Actors are getting it, rich people getting it, poor people getting it. And then, a few months in, we learned that's not true, right? That if you are lower income or socioeconomically depressed, if you are indigenous or Black and African American or person of color, you're more likely to die from the virus because of comorbidities that existed before, because you have food deserts, because you have been denied economic opportunity, you've been on the wrong side of social justice, you've experienced social injustices, and then this virus just showed us who we were as a country. And so you have the summer of Black Death, you have this virus that's impacting people. And then we got the news that they were building or planning to build this multi-billion-dollar pipeline in our community, Valero Energy Corporation, Plains All American, and it would double the amount of emissions that were coming out of the Valero oil refinery in Southwest Memphis. I love my home. I'm from Westwood through and through. Our community is beautiful, and it has 17 toxic release inventory facilities encapsulated around it. The cancer risk is 4.1 times the national average, and both of my grandmothers have died from cancer because of environmental racism. See, I didn't know those words until we were in the fight, until we were proximate to it, that is what killed them in their 60s. That's why they didn't make it to the graduations. They didn't see us becoming state representatives. It's because there have been people in positions of power for a very long time who did not care about the communities that were suffering. And it was because those communities were Black, it was because they were indigenous, it was because they were socioeconomically depressed, it was because we have been discarded and pushed to the periphery of the society that people have not paid attention. I say, if we cared where these plants were placed 40 years ago, we wouldn't have the climate crisis we do now. But there's a devaluation that is a real big part of exploitative capitalism. It's a devaluation of human beings and of our lives and of our air and of our water and of our soil. And what the environmental justice movement does, and what I believe we see happening across our country, is the people who are most proximate, the people who care a lot about the land, and who care about the water, and who care about the air that we breathe, are awakening the conscience of a whole lot of other people who have not paid attention. And so this community in Boxtown, which was built by formerly enslaved African Americans 150 or so years ago, got its name because people used materials from boxcars to build their homes. And if you ever come to Memphis, as some of my family here has, I'd love to take you there. And you will hear stories about how if you dig far enough into the ground, you can see the sand dust from the boxcars that they would cut up and that they would use to build their homes. This community, which was called, quote, the point of least resistance by Plains All American, when asked why they chose this location, they called our community, our home, the path of least resistance, becomes the point of resilience. Because what is also true about the communities that are oppressed and the communities that are suffering the most is that we still here.
Yes.
We still here. I look at my sister in the indigenous community who've been here for over 10,000 years. You have imperialism, you have colonialism, you have white supremacy that has been designed from day one to destroy the language and the voices. You got our universities like Dartmouth, which it was used to take away and strip away the power of indigenous communities and their attachment to history and their historicity. It's still here. You have Black folks who've been enslaved in this country for over 400 years, denied access to the right to vote, denied the opportunity to read, denied all of the privileges and the rights of being an American citizen, despite the fact that our blood helped to build this country. And even the institutions like the White House and the Capitol. Still here. And it is that perseverance, right, and that persistence that helps to lead the resistance and the movement that we are part of. And so when we think about how we win and how we have organized and thinking about the intersectional ways that justice is created, it is also thinking about the reason that we got to where we are. Why is it that the most polluted places are also the same places where you have the least amount of economic opportunity and the same places where you have the least amount of educational resource? These are the same places. And the same people who are being oppressed in our country. And so what then is the responsibility? Is it the responsibility of those who are in chains and those who are shackled to free themselves? And the history of this country has proven over and over again that oftentimes the leaders are the ones who are in chains, who do free themselves. But the way that we have a sustained movement for justice, the way that I believe, and I'd argue that the climate justice and environmental justice movement move forward, is that we build, as Heather McGee calls the solidarity dividend, and as Jane just mentioned, you build unlikely alliances. For us to change this country, for us to win this fight, which we will win, because we will never quit. We will win because we will never quit. Because we will win this fight, we have to make sure we have the right strategies and tools that are built around that solidarity dividend. It's the people with the privilege to be able to jump on these flights. It's the people with the privilege of these degrees. It's the people with the privilege of access to the White House and to the State Department. It's the people with privilege who are accountable and responsible for doing something. Because the people who are forced at the bottom are acting and are screaming. When I look at Boxtown, I look at Westwood, the cancer rates scream for themselves. The people who are being oppressed in our country, they are screaming. It is the people who do hold the megaphone, which in our society, in the American context, the people who hold the megaphone are actually the people in power. I held one on the State House floor. The people in power, right? The people in power have a responsibility to take the megaphone and give it to the folks who are screaming but are not being listened to. And so I heard my friend mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation committed over $500 million. And the question is, how much of that is going to the front lines? We need that money to go to the people who are fighting for their very breath. That's what it's about. It's not an ephemeral idea or ideal that we're talking about here. It's not just the 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's not the COP 26 or 28. I don't know what number it's at right now. That's not it, right? It's not the amazing climate week that's going to happen. Like, that's not it, right? Do the organization, mobilization, activation, talk about it all the time. It's the people who are fighting for their literal breath, their actual water, the very land that they live on, against these corporations who have infinite resources financially. But the reality is we've got an infinite resource too. It is love. Our infinite resource that was passed down from generation to generation is love. And see, shareholders can't buy that. Stockholders can't assemble it enough. You can't trade it on Wall Street. And what brings us and commits us, and what I believe you'll see in the stories that you read, is that each person who's willing to sacrifice themselves and their energy and their time and their lives for this movement to save the planet, literally. The renewable resource has been love for this planet and love for the people in our communities, love for our families, love for our grandmothers. That's what we have. And love wins. We beat Byhalia. We beat Keystone XL. We got a whole lot more that we are going to beat and that we are going to win as we do it together. And that is an important thing for us to do this work together, listening and allowing those who have been most impacted to lead with the support and the resources of those who sit in these fancy types of places. But it is going to be the people who are most impacted who will lead us toward a more just climate and toward a more just environment. And I'm more optimistic now than ever before. Because look at this. We here and we ain't going nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I mean, yes, we will not lose. The front lines will never lose because they will never give up.
That's right.
And this is why I wrote this book, because actually I didn't write it, why I made it happen, gathered it. Because these are the experts. These are the experts who have been winning. We know from the scientific experts that not one more fossil fuel project can be approved, built, or function. It just can't. They're making sure that they won't. And there are so many more Janes, Crystals, Justins who are working in their communities on the ground to protect the land, the water, the ancestors, the communities, the families, to protect what they love. For people who live there, every fossil fuel project is an existential threat. For every one of us who doesn't live there, every fossil fuel project is an existential threat. And they are an existential threat to the fossil fuel industry. This is power. I know you can feel it. The climate crisis and addressing the climate crisis is not a crisis of time or money or technology or ideas. It is a crisis of power. And yet, look what we've got. This is how we're going to win. We at the Equation Campaign believe in this technology. It's tried, it's true, it works. You don't have to even believe us, believe the oil companies, because they say it too. This is what we're investing in, and we are excited to have you here to join us. The book is the experience of people like this who have fought these David and Goliath battles. I did not write this book to sell it. I want people to read it because this is the expertise. These are the folks that we need to be listening to. And so I hope you all will take a book, we'll read it, we'll pass it on, we'll teach it, because this is what it's going to take. It's an equation. Power, love, beating pipelines. All right. Q&A. Okay, we're going to open it up for Q&A. And before we do, I also just want to shout out Aisha Siddiqa, who's in the audience and in the book. She is a youth climate activist, not so much, I mean, you're definitely very youthful, but unfortunately, the youth climate activists have been doing this for a long time already. And has a fantastic contribution. So would love to have you answer some questions too as people read them. But yeah, as people ask questions. So people want to ask questions?
Hi, thank you. I'm William Doyle, a 2017 Bellagio resident fellow alumni. And I must tell you, I am not only in awe of the four of you, I'm kind of in shock because in your own way, you're so incredibly inspiring. I mean, I wept when I saw you on the floor of the state legislature. I sat at home, watched the TV, I just started bawling because it was so powerful. And your comments about unlikely alliances with white Republican ranchers and farmers is I think a key to our future, because when you change the vocabulary back to its roots and its origins, as you do every day, from the American context, the indigenous American context, then I think we can all start waking up and seeing the love we have for each other potentially. I live in Finland now. My Rockefeller project led, it was about childhood well-being. So I moved my family and my child to Helsinki, where I'm studying childhood well-being. You mentioned education, and I'm reminded in the title of your book, "The Revolution Will Not Be Litigated." I'm reminded of Brown versus Board of Education, which included the beautiful phrase, quote, which I think should be on the doorway of every school and state house in America, that education is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms, unquote. That's settled national policy, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And today we're sitting right now in a city that should have the biggest Confederate flag in American history flying above the Board of Education, because this city is so, the capital of enlightenment and liberalism and all the rest, is so defiantly and hopelessly segregated, which of course we know what all that means. So my question to you is, the civil rights history, and I think the movement for environmental justice has so much in common, but your victories, what is the common denominators, what are they, for achieving the goals that we all share? What are the bullet points that you would communicate to a short attention span audience to achieve the goals that we should all be sharing? What do you see as, again, common denominators for winning?
I can start, which is, so we quote Audre Lorde in this book. It's sort of a like a theme that runs throughout, which is the tools of the master will not be will not break down the master's house, but they can temporarily beat him at his own game. And that's how I feel about law, that we need to use legal tools to temporarily beat him at his own game. But if we are going to fundamentally transform, like we're not talking in climate change or racial justice or indigenous land back or education about tweaking and fixing things and tweaking around the edges. We've got to radically transform the way that we think about the land and how we relate to it and how we use it. And so one is, I think the common denominators for me are that the vision is one of total transformation. We're not going to just sort of like replace the models with solar and wind. We got to do things massively differently. And these tools will not transform, but they can be used. Transformation comes from movements, comes from love, from pain, from organizing and collective power. That's what I would say.
I mean, I would say relationships. I really think that, you know, anything that I've done in my life, I've never done alone, nor are any of my ideas or anything I have done unique. You know, I stand on shoulders of giants. You know, we've all heard that phrase. Like, I come from a long lineage of people that have given their lives to protect this land, and people who have sacrificed literal death and like given for us to have access to the land that I'm currently on, right? And so I think that our relationships are key and they're important. And I think that is really the only way that we actually win is by having genuine, deep relationship with folks and going across movements, not just, you know, siloing into like environmental justice or social justice, but we all have to come together around all of these things, you know, and find some kind of common thread. And I think that'll be the thing.
Yeah. For me, you know, there's some common denominators that we all had that I think were successful in our fights. One, we did have funding. Like, no matter how good the ideas were or how powerful organizers we were, if we didn't have funding to lift up our fights, we wouldn't have won. So that's one. That it's a layered approach. You know, we didn't just focus on communications or focus on political or focus on legal. It was all of it. But it was always done with the people who were going to be impacted the most. So I didn't go to a polling firm and ask, you know, what narratives are going to most resonate with, you know, rural households on helping stop the Keystone XL pipeline. We held community meetings and listened to how people were describing their pain, their anger, what the companies were doing, what they were fighting to protect. That's how we built our narratives. And I think it's funding, having really strong communications. And so people who aren't in Nebraska or aren't in Memphis or aren't in North Dakota and Montana still feel that they can be part of the fight. That was really important for us. And then the legal piece. And I tell pipeline fighters everywhere, whenever we go and visit and are kind of helping mentor folks, I tell them, you can't put politics aside because so many of these decisions are political. And it means being uncomfortable and, you know, putting your thoughts of what is right kind of to the side and going sometime to your friends. Like Barack Obama was our friend, right? Hillary Clinton was our friend, but they were siding with TransCanada for the first, you know, 3/4 of the fight. So it also means kind of confronting our friends who are on the wrong side sometimes of these decisions, not putting the politics aside, confronting it and being political ourselves.
Write all those things down and tattoo them to yourself. I mean, relationships are extremely important. And I appreciate how Crystal raised that. And I have this thing like relationships before task. If you don't trust people, you're not going to go very far. If you don't trust the political leaders that you work with, if you don't trust the lawyers that you work with, if you don't trust the community-based organizations, if you don't trust them, you can have the same problem and never get to a solution. And I think where I'm from, trust is really hard to come by and very easy to lose. And in Boxtown and Westwood, if someone does trust you and you say you're going to do something, and you really have to commit to it. And I think for the attorneys who we worked with, for outside organizations. It was really like teaching people about sort of the culture of our communities and how we operate and function, but that all connects with like being proximate. What I love about the Southern Environmental Law Center and Breach Collective, who were sort of our key attorney groups, was they always said, we know that we are not the experts here. Right? Scotty Fitzgerald and Clyde Robinson, who were getting their land taken by eminent domain, they're the experts, right? It's Sarah Gladney and Mama Easter Knox and Batso Booker, right? Who've been at this fight and went to all of the meetings where the pipeline company was telling them, don't you like toothbrushes, right? Oil is good. And it's the folks who were going to suffer because 1 million people relied on our aquifer for drinking water that was going to be polluted by crude oil. And so I think I just love what Chris was saying there. It's like it's relationships before you get to the task. It's approaching people and addressing the issues, and you're fighting on all the fronts. For me, and I didn't have the experience of going like year after year after year, because there's something about how you sustain a movement. And I believe the interconnectedness that we are now seeing built thanks to the Equation Campaign, thanks to the Pipeline Fighter Subs, is something that what really wasn't there at the forefront even just a few years ago. So there's something new happening that is quite powerful. But thinking about the sustainability at that time for us was quite difficult, right? I'm a very small person. I lost 15 pounds, right, during our pipeline fight, because you literally are fighting on every front. Politically, you're pushing your county commission and your city council to pass resolutions, to pass laws. And at the same time, you're educating them about the dangers of this thing. And you're learning about aquifers, and you're learning about all these other things. You're learning about cancer risk. You're doing all of that while having another job at the time. This was not the full-time job, right? And so there's this political component that you have to participate in. There's a social component. This is a social justice and a racial justice issue, right? We're talking about the people being most impacted and an economic issue. The people being most impacted, again, indigenous people, Black folks, people of color, socioeconomically depressed people, the paths of least resistance that have been made in our communities. So you have to fight on like the social justice front, the racial justice front, and then there's the important legal aspect of it. You have to have better lawyers, right? What we found out was they had 20 lawyers on the Valero Energy Corporation Plains All-American Byhalia pipeline fight. At one point, we had 20 lawyers on our side who were better, right? Just frankly, right? We really did. But we really was having the capacity to level the playing field, right? If you level the playing field and you get people who are proximate fighting, we're not going to lose. But the reality is the same communities that are being oppressed have been denied the opportunities to have those resources. I'll tell you this quick thing about the pipeline fight. They had a different route at first, which was going to go through a community called Germantown, which was a wealthy white community. They changed the route completely from going, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. They didn't do that. And they said, well, we can't go there because they're rich white people. So we're going to snake all the way around Westwood, right, which is down in the literal southwest corner near Mississippi. And we're going to build the pipeline this way. Like, not a straight line. We're going to do this whole thing because our community, we've got lawyers, right? We didn't have the scientists. We didn't have all the resources that these other communities would. But what happens when we get them, right? What happens when you get Equation Campaign? What happens when you get Southern Environmental Law Center and you put those resources, people who have power choose a social location with the folks who've been disempowered, right? Like, that's what justice creation, that's where it happens. Right? And those are some of the things that I think we have seen work, and we have to replicate in a lot of different areas in order to win.
Yeah. All right. Well, the good news is that we get to talk amongst ourselves over drinks and food, my favorite part of the evening, besides the whole part of the evening. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, especially Justin, Jane, Crystal, for coming and sharing your wisdom with us. This is what it's going to take. Sometimes people say, oh, but gosh, there are so many fossil fuel projects around the world. Every single one, that's like whack-a-mole. Yeah, we got to whack every single mole. Every single mole, because, all right, Mike Salvi, high school friend, I suck at math, but I know this. We can't afford even one more. Do the math. Our carbon budget cannot afford it. We gotta walk every single mole. This is how it works. Tried and true. Join us. Join us. Join us for cocktails and drinks. Hot wine. Thank you, everyone.
Great job. Amazing, Chris.
Yeah,